This is a Federal News Network podcast.
In the long American struggle to bring stability to the Middle East, most of the attention and accolades have gone to the military and its leadership. Less appreciated is the work of diplomats and others in the State Department. A new book, The Ambassadors, fills in that part of the record, and author Paul Richter joins me now. Paul, good to have you on.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
What do you think is the essential misunderstanding or lack of knowledge that people have, even those in the federal government, of the role of diplomacy and diplomats in situations where there's also active warfare or civil war or strife going on?
Right. Well, the U.S. has, beginning with 9/11, began sending large numbers of personnel overseas to missions there, and the generals and to some extent the intelligence chiefs got a lot of the attention there. But leading the way with them were the ambassadors, who are in fact legally the senior U.S. leaders in missions overseas. So the ambassadors to these countries were unknown to most Americans, but they were really leading the show.
And I remember at some point during the early parts of all of this that the former Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, expressed the desire to have greater partnership and greater participation by the State Department in activities that would perhaps prevent the need for troops or lower the investment needed for troops and hot warfare over there. How do you interpret that situation?
Well, Bob Gates and a lot of other military leaders understood the importance of diplomacy. Their view is that if these issues can be worked out and negotiated between two countries, then there won't be a need, or there'll be a lessened need for military presence. And it's a lot cheaper to do it through diplomacy than it is using large military forces.
And I want to ask you about a couple of particular situations in the book. One concerns Ann Patterson, who I believe is retired now, but she had quite a bit to do with Pakistan and keeping, as your chapter is titled, Keeping the Lid On. And an incident that occurred when there was great floods happening in Pakistan because of spring rains, and the president was out of town, in fact, out of the country, out of the continent, touring the heads of Europe. Tell us about that incident.
One of an ambassador's role is to help the local government in some cases. And in this case, the President Zardari, didn't quite have the political tuning that he needed to lead Pakistan. He was new to the job when he took it over. And so Pakistan had some of its worst flooding in history in 2010, and people across the country were suffering. Homes were lost. Many people were drowned. Meanwhile, President Zardari was on a luxury tour of Western Europe, visiting his family's castle in France and dining in London. And there was an outcry in Pakistan about, where is Zardari? He didn't want to come home, but Ann Patterson got him on the phone and said, Mr. President, you shouldn't be out there. You need to be home, or there's going to be an even worse political crisis. So President Zardari came home and went out and met with the suffering Pakistanis.
So in other words, he listened to the American ambassador and took her political advice.
Right. She was giving him advice on domestic politics like that, but also on defense issues, on finance, even on his personal problems in some cases. He came to office inexperienced, and he looked to Ambassador Patterson for help on some of these issues. And she was eager, the entire U.S. government was eager to have Pakistan remain a stable country and not have the government fall to a military coup, which has been always a threat in Pakistan.
We're speaking with Paul Richter. He's a foreign policy and national security reporter and author of The Ambassadors. And did it strike you in putting together this book that the people that you outlined, the four big-time ambassadors, many of whom started out as career civil servants? They were not presidential appointees until maybe later in their careers. and they didn't start out from the political realm, but from people that just came out of college and wanted to do good.
They came through the Foreign Service. They were Foreign Service officers and learned all the rules that way and came up through the system.
The other one that was interesting was Robert Ford. The description you give of his activities and the activities of the staff in Syria during those early days of the Arab Spring, when there was when the crackdown in Syria started. Tell us some of the highlights of what you relate there.
Robert Ford had been in Iraq for 5 years. Afterwards, they decided to send him to Syria as ambassador before the Civil War broke out. And Ford was not expecting this was going to be another assignment where he'd be on the front lines of battle. But within weeks after he got there, the unrest began in Syria. There were then peaceful demonstrations. And the people in Washington told Robert Ford, we've got our hands full of a lot of other issues in the Middle East now, so we want you to work out how you're going to handle this unrest in Syria. Robert Ford decided that he wanted to be an observer of the demonstrations, and he began going out to demonstrations. And it became quite risky because the Assad government in Syria didn't like the idea of an American diplomat being there. And the situation got hotter and hotter for Robert Ford. He began, in some cases, he was chased by government agents in the streets who were trying to keep him from appearing publicly. In another case, a mob of government agents stormed the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, and Robert was obviously in the middle of that. He almost had to order the Marine Guards to shoot on these invaders into the embassy. So it got hotter and hotter, and finally the U.S. Embassy had to close down, and Robert Ford came back to Washington and continued to serve as ambassador to Syria, but did it from outside the country.
And then, of course, there's Chris Stevens, who was famously killed in the Benghazi incident, and getting away from all of the politics that ensued around that. What do you think is something people may not know about that incident or about Chris Stevens that they should know?
Stevens was not eager to serve in a combat zone. He had tried to get out of serving in Iraq because he thought it would be really unpleasant for a diplomat to have to serve in that militarized situation. But he liked Libya. He'd served there as the number 2 diplomat in the U.S. Embassy in Libya. And so he volunteered to go in when a civil war broke out in Libya. He went in as the U.S. envoy to the Libyan rebels and was there during the NATO bombardment in 2011. Then he went back in 2012 as the U.S. ambassador to Libya, and that's when he was killed along with 3 other Americans in the attack on the U.S. facility in Benghazi, Libya.
So in a lot of cases, plain old physical bravery was really required.
Yes, and a number of these people, Robert Ford and Chris Stevens especially, they weren't originally looking for action on the front lines. Both Stevens and Robert Ford had been Peace Corps volunteers in Morocco, and that was the kind of assignment they were expecting. But when these assignments got a lot hotter, they stayed with it. They were willing to go, and they put up with extreme risks to themselves.
And what do you hope will be the impact of this book?
Well, I'm hoping that it'll provide a little more public understanding of the contributions of these people. We're at a moment with all the fuss over Ukraine when there's a lot of debate about career foreign service officers, and the question is, what are they contributing? Now, the Trump administration sees them sometimes as a kind of a deep state. But in fact, they've been contributing more than a lot of people realize. They've been in leadership roles in these overseas missions for a very long time.
Paul Richter is a foreign policy and national security reporter and author of The Ambassadors. Thanks so much for joining me.